Okay, so you know how we've been sharing all those interesting articles and stuff about the workplace?
Yeah.
Well, this time, you guys gave us a whole bunch of material about this thing called industrial and organizational psychology,
Mm-hmm.
IO psychology for short. And it's a lot to dig through, so we're
Right.
going to go through it all and pull out like the big ideas, the stuff that really makes you go, huh, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Basically, a crash course on IO psychology, straight from the source material.
Sounds good.
All right, so first things first, let's just get right to it. What is IO psychology?
Well, it's all about using like scientific methods to really study how workplaces function.
Okay.
But it's not just about making businesses more, efficient and productive.
Right.
It's also really focused on how to make work better for the people doing it.
Gotcha.
Like, how can we boost well-being, make people happier and more fulfilled at work?
So both sides of the coin.
Ex
Interesting. And I noticed the name itself, industrial and organizational psychology, seems like it's had a bit of a journey.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it shows how the field itself has changed over time.
Hmm.
In the early days, it was mostly called industrial psychology, and it was really focused on things like efficiency and productivity,
Okay.
almost like applying engineering principles to work.
Like optimizing the machine.
Yeah, exactly. But then there was this brief period right around the mid-1940s in the US
Right.
where the American Psychological Association, they actually had a division called Industrial and Business Psychology.
Interesting.
But then it switched back to just industrial psychology for a while before finally becoming industrial and organizational psychology.
Right.
That happened around the 1990s in the US, though it seems Europe adopted that broader view earlier.
Uh-huh.
It's funny, though, because the main group for IO psychologists, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, they actually added organizational to their name way back in 1973.
Wow. Ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
So is work and organizational psychology the same thing? I've heard that term too.
Yeah, it's basically the same idea, but work and organizational psychology is used more broadly, especially in Europe.
Okay.
It includes like a wider range of work-related topics.
Got it.
But from the sources you gave me, it looks like IO psychology is still the preferred term in the US, at least as of 2025.
All right. Good to know. So it's a distinct area within psychology. How does it relate to other fields like, say, clinical or counseling psychology?
Right. So IO psychology is what's called an applied area of psychology.
That's-
Just like those other fields you mentioned, clinical, counseling, school psychology, even sports psychology.
I see.
And one thing that's really interesting is that both IO and clinical psychology use something called the scientist practitioner model.
Okay, break that down for me. What does it actually mean?
So basically, it means that people in these fields aren't just, sitting in ivory towers coming up with theories.
Yeah.
They're out there actually working with people, solving real-world problems.
Applying your knowledge.
Exactly. And they use scientific research to understand the problems they see in their work.
Uh-huh.
And then what they learn from those real-world experiences actually helps to improve the scientific research and knowledge in the field.
A feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine an IO psychologist notices that a lot of employees in a company are experiencing burnout.
Okay.
They might use research methods to figure out exactly what's causing it.
Right, yeah.
And then they would take those findings and actually design programs or interventions to try and reduce that burnout.
Practical solutions.
Exactly.
So what kind of questions might an IO psychologist typically focus on?
Oh, there's a whole range. I mean, it really varies.
Sure.
They might look at how the physical layout of an office can lead to stress and burnout, for example.
That makes sense.
Or they might explore how different reward systems, like bonuses or promotions, can impact employee motivation and how well they perform their jobs.
Interesting.
Or even how to help older employees adapt to new technologies in the workplace.
So it's about people and how they function in the work environment.
Exactly.
That's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah.
So what might a typical day look like for an IO psychologist?
Well, like I said, there's a huge range of what they do.
Right.
It can be anything from designing recruitment and selection processes, figuring out the best ways to attract and choose the right candidates for a job,
Okay.
to developing training programs to help employees improve their skills.
Uh-huh.
They might even work with like CEOs and top executives, helping them improve their leadership and strategy.
So all levels of the organization.
Yeah, pretty much. And sometimes they also work on things like ergonomics, which is all about designing workspaces and tools to be safe and comfortable for people to use.
Making sure the physical environment is supportive.
Exactly.
Now, I noticed the lecture notes you sent over seem to be from a university in Turkey.
Uh-huh.
And they really stressed that you need a master's degree to even be considered a psychologist there.
Right, yeah. From what I gathered, in Turkey, you generally need at least a master's degree to be officially recognized as a psychologist.
So not just a bachelor's.
No, not in those fields, at least according to the Turkish system.
Hmm.
A master's degree means you have specialized knowledge and training in a specific area of psychology.
Okay.
And then a PhD shows even deeper expertise, usually focused on research and, contributing to the academic side of things.
More the theoretical side.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The lecturer also mentioned there's a very specific legal definition for who can use the title clinical psychologist in Turkey.
Really?
Yeah,
Fascinating how those professional standards can vary so much from country to country.
for sure.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the impact of the work environment itself. One thing that stood out to me was the concept of commute.
Okay, yeah.
It seems it's something outside of work,
Yeah.
but the lecture notes talked about it in the context of IO psychology. How does that fit in?
It might not seem directly related to the work itself, but how people get to and from work, how long it takes, the mode of transportation, all of that can actually have a big impact on their well-being and their psychology.
Sure, I could see that.
And that, in turn, affects their work.
It makes sense if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're stressed out from a horrible commute, you're not going to be in the best state of mind when you get to work.
Exactly.
And the lecture notes even mentioned commute times in Istanbul ranging from just 15 minutes to over 2 hours.
Oh, wow.
I can't imagine dealing with a 2-hour commute each way every day.
Yeah, that's rough.
That's got to take a toll.
For sure. I mean, all that extra time and the stress that comes with it, it can definitely affect your mood, your energy levels when you get to work,
Mhm.
and even your overall job satisfaction. So it's something IO psychologists really consider when looking at the bigger picture of the employee experience.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Now, there was also some discussion about those, like, Silicon Valley-style workplaces.
Oh,
The ones that are super informal, almost like a playground for adults.
right.
What's the take on those from an IO perspective?
Well, there are different viewpoints on that.
Okay.
Some people argue that these informal environments can really help with things like creativity and collaboration.
Sure, I can see that.
And they can make work more enjoyable, you
Mm,
know?
right.
The idea is to get rid of the traditional rigid hierarchies and make work feel less stuffy and formal.
But I could also see how that might not be ideal for every type of work.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the lecture notes mention that some people find it really hard to concentrate in those kinds of environments.
Yeah, if you need to really focus on something complex, all that noise and interaction could be a problem.
Exactly,
And it probably depends on your personality too, right?
for sure.
Some people thrive in that kind of buzzing social atmosphere, while others need peace and quiet to do their best work.
Absolutely. It's like what might be great for a brainstorming session with a marketing team might be a total nightmare for a software developer trying to write GAN.
Exactly.
So the takeaway seems to be that flexibility is key.
Okay.
Companies should offer different types of workspaces to accommodate different needs and preferences.
Makes sense. One size doesn't fit all.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about something else that's really important for both employees and organizations. Work-life balance.
Yeah.
I've noticed that even the language we use to talk about this has evolved over time.
Oh, definitely. In the past, the focus was a lot on conflict, like work-to-family conflict or family-to-work conflict.
Okay.
It was all about how these two parts of life could clash and create stress.
Like they were competing forces.
Right. But now, the focus is more on work-life balance.
More of a positive spin.
Yeah, it's about finding a way for work and personal life to coexist and support each other, rather than just constantly battling each other.
Harmony, not conflict. So can you give me some concrete examples of those conflicts?
Sure. Like imagine someone named John who works 12-hour days, 6 days a week.
Makes.
He's super dedicated to his job, but he has almost no time or energy left for his family.
Right.
That's a classic work-to-family conflict.
Makes sense. What about the other way around?
Well, think about someone like Adam, a single dad who's constantly struggling with childcare.
Okay.
He's often late for work or has to take time off unexpectedly because his kid is sick or something.
So his family responsibilities are interfering with his work.
Exactly. That's a family-to-work conflict.
And I feel like with technology and remote work and everything, It's even harder to maintain that work-life balance these days.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're constantly connected, always reachable.
Right.
It can be really tough to switch off from work and truly relax and recharge.
Like the boundaries have become so blurred.
Yeah, exactly.
So why is it so important to get that balance right? What are the benefits?
Well, for employees, good work-life balance can lead to less stress, less burnout, and better overall well-being.
Okay.
They're happier, healthier, and they have more fulfilling relationships outside of work.
And I imagine that translates to better work performance too, right?
Absolutely. When people are less stressed and more balanced, they tend to be more focused, more creative, and more productive at work.
So it benefits both the employee and the employer.
Exactly. It's a win-win. Ideally, you want work to stay at work, and you want personal life to stay out of work. It's
Yeah.
like this mutual supportive thing.
Makes sense. All right, let's dive into a bit of IO history. The lecture notes mentioned Hugo Minsterberg as a really influential figure early on. What was so special about his work?
Hugo Minsterberg, yeah, he was a big deal. I mean, he was one of the first to really show how psychology could be used to solve problems in the workplace.
Okay.
And he wrote two super important books, Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, which was basically the very first textbook in the field,
Right.
and The Theory of Advertising. Psychology and Industrial Efficiency was published in the early 1900s,
Got it.
and it covered stuff like employee selection and fatigue in the workplace.
So the early foundations of IO.
Yeah, and, back then, textbooks were hugely important.
Why is that?
Well, there weren't all these academic journals and online resources like we have now.
Right.
So textbooks were how people learn about a new field.
The primary source of knowledge.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
They were essential for teaching and for establishing a field as a legitimate area of study.
So his textbooks really helped to define IO psychology in those early days.
Absolutely.
The lecture notes also mention World War I as a turning point for IO psychology.
Yeah, World War I was a really interesting time for the field.
How so?
Well, suddenly, there was this huge need to assess and classify a massive number of recruits.
Right. They needed to figure out who was best suited for what role in the military.
Exactly. So IO psychologists stepped in and developed some of the very first intelligence tests.
Oh, wow.
These tests were used to help decide where to place soldiers, what jobs they would be best at.
So IO had a really practical application in the war effort.
Yeah, definitely. The most famous examples are the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests.
I've heard of those.
The Alpha test was for recruits who could read and write, and the Beta test was for those who couldn't or who didn't speak English.
Okay.
These tests were largely developed by a guy named Robert Yerkes and his team.
Interesting.
And they were some of the earliest examples of using psychological tests on such a large scale in a real-world setting.
Really groundbreaking.
Yeah.
The name Cattell also came up in the context of early IO psychology. What was his contribution?
Right, so James McKeen Cattell, he was another important figure,
Okay.
was a big believer in the idea of individual differences.
Meaning people are not all the same.
Exactly. He believed that understanding those individual differences was key to predicting how people would behave, especially in the workplace.
Makes sense.
He also developed his own intelligence tests. And perhaps most significantly, he founded the Psychological Corporation.
And what was that?
The Psychological Corporation became a major publisher of psychological tests and materials.
So he had a huge impact on the practical side of psychological assessment.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about a concept I've always found fascinating, the Hawthorne effect.
Oh, yeah, the Hawthorne effect.
So one of those things you hear about a lot in the discussions about workplace studies. Can you tell me the story behind it?
Sure. So the Hawthorne effect gets its name from a series of studies done at the Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works in Chicago.
Okay.
This was between 1927 and 1932.
Got it.
And the studies were led by Elton Mayo and his team.
And what were they looking at?
Well, initially, they wanted to see how changing the physical working conditions would affect productivity.
Like literally changing the environment.
Yeah, they were tweaking things like the lighting levels, how long breaks were, and even the length of the workday.
And they were measuring how those changes impacted how much work got done. So what did they find?
Well, here's the interesting part. They found that productivity tended to go up no matter what changes they made.
Wait, really? So even if they made the working conditions worse, productivity still improved?
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. Like, even when they dimmed the lights, people worked harder.
So weird.
It was like the changes themselves didn't really matter as much as the fact that the employees were being observed.
Ah, so the attention was the key factor.
That's the main interpretation, yeah. They figured out that just knowing they were part of a study, that someone was paying attention to them, made people work harder.
Like they felt valued and important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Hawthorne effect is often used to describe how people's behavior can change just because they know they're being watched.
That's pretty powerful.
It is, though it's worth noting that the original Hawthorne studies have been reanalyzed and debated quite a bit over the years.
Really?
Yeah, some researchers question whether the original conclusions were entirely accurate. But still, the idea of the Hawthorne effect is really important.
It shows that the social and psychological aspects of work can have a huge impact.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about the people in the workplace. The lecture emphasized the importance of recognizing individual differences.
Right.
Why is that so crucial in IO psychology?
Well, IO psychology is all about understanding people and how they function at work.
Right.
And the fact is, people are different.
No two people are exactly alike.
Exactly. We all have different abilities, skills, personalities, and all sorts of other characteristics.
So it wouldn't make sense to treat everyone the same.
Exactly. And that's why recognizing those individual differences is so important for things like hiring the right people, training them effectively, and even designing jobs that fit their strengths.
It's about tailoring the work environment to the individual, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The lecture notes mention something called Fleischmann's taxonomy of human attributes. What's that all about?
Oh yeah, Fleischmann's taxonomy.
It sounds pretty technical.
It's basically a framework that identifies 52 different human attributes.
52.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive.
And these are all attributes that have been shown to be linked to success in various jobs, right?
Exactly. And interestingly, over a third of those attributes, 21 out of the 52, are cognitive abilities.
Cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
Like intelligence and problem-solving skills.
Yeah, exactly.
So brain power is pretty important for most jobs.
It definitely plays a big role, but the taxonomy also includes things like psychomotor abilities.
Okay, what are those?
Psychomotor abilities are things like reaction time, dexterity, coordination, basically how well you can control your movements.
So like how quickly a surgeon can react during an operation.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Or think about a pilot. They need excellent hand-eye coordination.
Right.
So depending on the job, these physical abilities can be just as important as cognitive skills.
Makes sense. And the lecture also talked about something called KSAOs.
BSAOs, yes.
Can you explain what each of those letters stands for and why they're important?
Sure. KSAOs stands for knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics.
Okay.
It's a really common framework used to describe the essential qualities someone needs to do a job well.
So like a checklist of what to look for in a candidate.
Yeah, kind of. So knowledge refers to the information and facts someone has learned, like knowing accounting principles or understanding the history of a company.
Got it.
Skills are things you can do, things you've learned through practice and experience, like being able to use a specific software program or being a good public speaker.
Okay, so knowledge is what you know and skills are what you can do.
Exactly. Then abilities are more like your innate talents, your potential, things like intelligence, physical strength, or musical ability.
Got it. So those are more like your natural gifts.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have other characteristics, which is kind of a catch-all category.
What kind of things fall under that?
Well, it includes things like personality traits, values, interests, even your work history and life experiences that aren't directly related to knowledge or skills.
So more like the soft skills and personal qualities.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that formal education, like degrees, is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Real-world experience can be just as valuable, if not more so.
It's about what you can actually do, not just what you've learned in a classroom.
Exactly.
So for example, if you're hiring a marketing manager, you might look for someone with knowledge of marketing principles, skills in social media and content creation, the ability to think strategically and solve problems, and maybe other characteristics like being a good communicator and team player.
Perfect example.
Okay, now, diversity and inclusion are obviously huge topics in the workplace these days.
Definitely.
The lecture notes focused specifically on disability. What were some of the key takeaways there?
Right. So the main message was about creating a work environment that's truly welcoming and inclusive for everyone, regardless of ability. And they talked about the importance of using respectful language when talking about disability.
All right.
Some people prefer identity-first language, like disabled person, while others prefer person-first language, like person with a disability.
It's about respecting individual preferences.
Exactly. But the most important thing is to remember that people with disabilities are valuable members of the workforce.
Absolutely.
They bring unique talents and perspectives to the table.
The lecture also mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA.
Right.
How does that apply to the workplace?
So the ADA is a law in the U.S. that protects people with disabilities from discrimination in employment.
Okay.
It also requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations so that people with disabilities can do their jobs effectively.
So things like wheelchair ramps or accessible restrooms.
Yeah, exactly. Or things like providing screen readers for someone with a visual impairment or allowing more frequent breaks for someone with a chronic illness.
Making the workplace accessible and supportive.
Right. And the ADA has a specific legal definition of what constitutes a disability.
Okay.
It includes having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities.
Like walking, seeing, or hearing.
Exactly. Or things like learning, concentrating, or interacting with others.
So it's a pretty broad definition.
It is. And it's important to note that most mitigating measures, like medications or assistive devices, aren't considered when determining if someone has a disability under the ADA.
Okay.
Except for ordinary eyeglasses or contact lenses.
Interesting.
The ADA also protects people who are associated with someone who has a disability.
So like if you're caring for a child with a disability.
Exactly. You can't be discriminated against because of that.
Makes sense.
And, it's estimated that somewhere between 12% and 15% of the world's population has a disability.
Wow, that's a significant portion of the workforce.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift our focus to how we measure performance in the workplace.
Okay.
What are some of the key terms we should know?
Well, three important terms are productivity, effectiveness, and efficiency.
All right, let's break those down.
Sure. So productivity is basically how much output you're getting for a given input.
Okay.
Like how many widgets are you producing per hour of work?
Got it. So it's about the ratio of output to input.
Exactly. Effectiveness is about whether you're actually achieving your goals.
So it's not just about working hard, it's about working smart.
Yeah, it's about achieving the desired results. And then efficiency is about using your resources wisely.
Okay.
So doing things in a way that minimizes wasted time, money, and effort.
So being efficient means you're doing things the right way, not just doing the right things.
Exactly.
Got it. And when we talk about overall employee performance, what are the main factors that IO psychologists consider?
Right. So employee performance is often broken down into three main components.
Okay.
First, there's task performance, which is basically how well someone does their actual job duties.
So the core responsibilities of their role.
Right. Then there are organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCBs.
OCBs.
Yeah, these are the things people do that go above and beyond their job description.
Like helping out a colleague with a project.
Exactly.
Huh.
Or volunteering for extra tasks, or being a really positive representative of the company.
So basically being a good citizen of the organization.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And these behaviors aren't required, they're voluntary.
They show initiative and a willingness to go the extra mile.
Exactly. And the motivation for OCBs is often altruism, which means wanting to help others without expecting anything in return.
Okay.
And then on the flip side, we have counterproductive work behaviors, or CWBs.
CWBs, the opposite of OCBs.
Yeah, these are the negative things people do that can harm the organization or the people in it.
So things like stealing or sabotage.
Yeah, those are serious examples. But CWBs can also include less extreme, but still problematic behaviors like being rude or gossiping.
Oh, right, like workplace incivility.
Exactly. Those smaller, everyday negative behaviors can really add up over time.
Yeah, they can create a toxic work environment.
Exactly. And the lecture specifically talked about ostracism, which is basically being ignored and excluded.
Like social rejection.
Yeah, and it can be incredibly damaging.
I can imagine.
It makes people feel invisible and worthless, almost like a social death.
That's heavy.
Yeah, and it can actually be more harmful than more overt forms of harassment.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought of that.
It's because it's this constant message that you don't matter, that you're not even worth acknowledging.
That's rough.
Yeah.
The lecture also touched on workplace accidents and safety. What's the IO perspective on that?
Right. So in IO psychology, we talk about occupational accidents.
Right.
These are unexpected events that happen at work or while someone is doing work-related activities.
So like if someone trips and falls in the office.
Yeah, that's an example. Or if someone gets injured while operating machinery.
Makes sense.
And it can get a bit tricky when it comes to things like commuting.
Right, because that's not technically at the workplace.
Exactly. But sometimes accidents that happen during a commute can be considered work-related, especially if the person is driving a company vehicle.
Okay.
But if they're using their own car or public transportation, it might be classified differently.
I see. So it depends on the context.
Yeah. But the bottom line is that occupational safety is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
And the International Labor Organization, the ILO, has some pretty alarming statistics about how many people are killed or injured at work each year.
Wow, that's sobering.
It is. And it highlights why it's so crucial for organizations to have good safety practices in place.
To prevent accidents and protect their employees.
Exactly. And that includes things like addressing risks from heat exposure, especially for people working outdoors or in hot environments.
Right. Heat stroke is a real danger.
Yeah, it can be deadly.
So how do organizations actually measure employee performance? The lecture notes mentioned 360-degree feedback.
Right, 360-degree feedback is a really interesting tool.
How does that work?
Well, instead of just getting feedback from your boss, you get feedback from all sorts of people you work with.
So like your colleagues, your subordinates, even your clients.
Yeah, exactly. It can include your supervisor, your peers, your direct reports if you have any, and sometimes even external stakeholders like customers or clients.
So it's a much more well-rounded perspective on your performance.
That's the idea. It's meant to give you a more complete picture of your strengths and weaknesses.
And it's used for development, not necessarily for deciding on promotions or firings.
Right. It's more about helping people grow and improve.
Makes sense. But regardless of the method used, there are always potential biases in performance evaluations.
Oh, definitely.
What are some of the common ones?
Well, one is the leniency or strictness error. This is when someone is either too easy or too harsh in their ratings, regardless of the actual performance.
Like they either give everyone high scores or low scores.
Exactly. And it can make it hard to differentiate between people who are